What's going on?
I don't know. Oh, there it goes again.
Why is it doing that?
Just a minute. Come on. Come on. Come on. No, not that again.
That's not the way it looked in the manual.
I know. Look, do you want to do this?
I thought you were the one who said you could get this thing to work.
Learning a program as powerful as After Effects isn't easy. But there is a solution. Total AE is a comprehensive 9-tape course for both beginners and experts you can't afford to be without. Go inside the mind of award-winning AE master Brian Maffitt. As you quickly learn the tricks and shortcuts to After Effects, you'll see how much time and money you can save. This series is packed full of Brian's tips, tricks, and techniques. For a fraction of the cost of a seminar or on-site trainer, you can have this valuable reference always at your fingertips. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the tape. And watch for the phone number so you can find out how to order the entire series.
Wow, how did he do that?
The concepts in these tapes are presented in sections, and most sections have demo projects included on the CD-ROM that came with your tapes. At the beginning of each section, the name of the appropriate project will appear beneath the title to let you know what you should have open if you want to follow along. In addition to that, each title slide will contain the current running time of the tape. Inside your video box, you'll find a little reference sheet so you can easily jump to the subjects you need, although we encourage you to watch the whole thing at least once to make sure you don't miss any tips or tricks. You can really increase your speed and productivity in After Effects if you take the time to learn the keyboard shortcuts for common tasks. I'll usually refer to shortcuts as I use them, and the names of the keys will appear on screen whenever appropriate to remind you that they're there. There's a quick reference guide of keyboard shortcuts that came with your copy of After Effects. I recommend that you keep this handy while you're working with the tapes. Hi, welcome to Total AE. My name is Brian Maffitt, and I'll be guiding you through the twists and turns of working with one of the most powerful creative tools on the planet, Adobe After Effects. You're about to get a detailed exploration of the After Effects interface, along with a whole bunch of secret tips, tricks, and animation techniques to get you up and running as soon as possible. Or if you're already up and running, to carry you on to the next level. After Effects is the industry-leading program for compositing, 2D animation, and special effects. Professionals working in film, video, and interactive entertainment rely on After Effects for its power and stability. Its animation controls are second to no other program in the industry. Once you learn the After Effects interface, you'll have precise control over all aspects of your animation. And the really great thing is that all of this animation power is extremely fun to work with. There's nothing like a well-designed tool to let you relax and enjoy your work. Once you really get to know this program, there's practically nothing you can't do with it. During the course of these tapes, you'll be given a detailed tour of the After Effects interface. There's a lot there. It can be overwhelming at first. You have a wealth of powerful features to learn, and chances are you might never have seen an interface quite like this one. If things begin to overwhelm you, stop the tape and practice what you've seen. Don't expect to get everything the first time through. Sometimes things make sense only when you understand the relationship between different aspects of the program. In addition to following along with projects, occasionally I'll give you an exercise to see if you can apply the concepts learned in the previous section. During the exercise, you're encouraged again to turn off the tape and try to complete a task. Once you've finished, or if you get stuck, you can resume the tape to see how I would accomplish the same task. Sometimes we'll both arrive at the same destination by taking completely different paths. That's okay. I'll usually try to show you the most efficient way to do something, but After Effects often provides many solutions to the same problem. One thing's for sure, people who take the time to learn After Effects don't regret the investment. After Effects is a genuinely great piece of software. Well, enough of me yakking. You got these tapes to learn After Effects, so let's dive in. When you first open up After Effects, a new untitled project pops into place, and a whole bunch of windows show up. Now, we're going to start from scratch in a later project. For now, let's open up a pre-made project. So go up to File, select Open Project, and pick the generic project in the Tape 1 folder on your CD. Okay. Now let's look at the windows. The big window on the left with all the items in it is the project window. Let's move a couple of things out of the way here. Every project has a single unique project window. The project window is the bin that footage is stored in. Different types of footage are identified by unique icons. And you can sort the footage by any number of criteria. You can sort by name, by type, size, duration, and if you open the window up far enough, we'll pull it over so we can see the right side. You can even sort by file path, although why you would need to do that. But it is useful occasionally to open up and check the path of something if you need to determine where you've stored it. All right, items can be stored in folders. Now you can create a new folder by picking New Folder from the File menu. Items can be drug into and out of folders in order to organize things. Now, this may seem a little extreme with a project as small as this one, where we only have a handful of clips, but when you're working on a much larger project that may have hundreds of elements, it does get pretty important that you organize them in a way that makes sense. If we look at the bottom of the project window a little ways, you can see the unique icons for audio files, for QuickTime movies with audio, and for a sequence of images, in this case, picked files that have been combined into a movie by After Effects. Now, when you click on an item, you get a lot more information on the item up here at the top of the project window. You get a little icon telling you what the clip looks like, or at least what the first frame of it looks like. If it has audio, you get a little audio track underneath it. And it tells you the dimensions, the duration, the frame rate, how many colors make it up, and how the alpha channel is interpreted, and if it's QuickTime movie, how it's compressed. All of this information can be very helpful when you're trying to sort through items or when you're trying to troubleshoot or whatever. Now, we won't import any files right now, but to import files into After Effects, you go File, Import, and you have a variety of choices here. You can bring in a single file. Shortcut for that is Control-I. You can import a number of files in one procedure by picking Footage Files. If you've brought over a file from a PC or whatever, and After Effects isn't able to automatically tell what it is, but you know it's a target file, for example, you can force After Effects to open footage as. You can bring in an entire After Effects project as a folder. All of the items will appear in their own folder, and this is a great way to combine several different projects into one piece. And you can also bring in a layered Photoshop file as a pre-made composition. All of the layers in Photoshop will retain their properties, their transfer modes, their position, etc., and will come in as a pre-built composition ready to be animated. And if your footage isn't done yet, but you know how long it's going to be and what its resolution is going to be, you could bring in a representative file as a placeholder to work with. And when you import a placeholder, you basically type in the name of what you want your file ultimately to be, the size of what your footage is going to be, and the duration. When you click OK, you get a little color bars thing with missing name at the top. After Effects, by the way, generates these automatically if a piece of footage is missing when you open up a file. Later on, if you double-click the color bars, you'll get a dialog box that allows you to select the footage that's missing or the footage that you'd like to replace the placeholder with. We've already mentioned that if you click on an item, you get information at the top of the project window here, but if you double-click on an item, it pops open this little footage window. In the footage window, you can get a lot of useful information about a particular clip. The most useful little box in here is probably the little alpha channel box here that lets you check your transparency information for a particular layer. You can also, if you like, take a snapshot of the layer, display the snapshot you've taken in another window. But these two things tend to be more useful in compositions. If you need to check whether or not a graphic is title safe or action safe, you have access to the grids here. And you can display at a variety of resolutions with a little resolution pop-up in the lower left-hand corner. These pop-ups and icons show up in a lot of windows, so once you learn them in one place, you've learned them everywhere. Now, if you open up a footage window for a picked sequence, it comes up in After Effects window just like a piece of still footage where you can check the alpha channel. In this case, it's completely opaque, so there's no black in the channel. Pushing the space bar lets you get a little preview of the animation. That was for a picked sequence. If you open up a QuickTime movie, like Countdown, it opens up in a QuickTime window, not After Effects' movie window. In the case of this QuickTime movie, it has a straight alpha, and that gives you a lot of jaggy edges and stuff because the alpha, the transparency masking information, has not been multiplied into the RGB channel yet. I'll talk about this in greater detail in a later tape, but just be aware that there are times when the plain old Apple QuickTime movie won't do. And for those times, if you hold down the Alt key when you double-click on a piece of footage to check it out, it will open it up instead, pre-multiplied, looking pretty, in After Effects' window. This one's a little too big for you to see all the details, so if you hit Control-, we'll zoom it down so you can see the whole things. And here you can check things like the alpha channel to see what's transparent or whatever. Double-click a piece of music, comes up in a little QuickTime player where you can play it. Now, again, if you Alt double-click, it brings up the music in After Effects' window. But there's no reason to do this with audio. There's nothing to check as far as alpha or any kind of video information at all. So it's a feature, but that's not something you'll ever need. Okay, let's go look at the other windows. All right, the small box of tools up here is the toolbox. Now, most of these tools are grayed out right now because we don't have a composition open. We don't have any elements to manipulate. But I just want to point out real quick what the different tools are. You'll do most of your manipulation with the arrow tool, which is what's selected right now. Just to the right of that is a little arrow going in a circle. That's the rotate tool. The rectangle underneath the arrow tool is a masking tool. Creates rectangular masks so that you can crop stuff. Just to the right of that is an oval mask. The pen tool is for creating mask shapes that are irregular or for editing motion paths. To the right of that, you have the anchor point or pan behind tool, and I'll explain that more in depth when we get to it. And a couple of other graphics tools that show up a lot in other programs, the hand tool, which lets you pan around inside of a window, and the zoom in, zoom out tool. All of these tools have keyboard shortcuts. The letter Q gets you the arrow key. The letter W gets you the rotate tool. These two don't seem to make sense as far as the letters meaning anything, but they are conveniently located right next to each other on the keypad where you can reach them very quickly. The rectangle mask is the C key. The oval mask is the letter V, think oval. The pen tool is the letter G. The letter Y will get you the anchor point editor. The hand tool is the letter H. Thank goodness something has the right letter. And the magnifying glass is the letter Z. If you think zoom, that kind of makes sense. Now the time control panel basically operates like a VCR control panel. When you have a composition open and you're working in the composition and you want to move around in time, you have the option of using the time control panel here to push play or move ahead a frame at a time or move to the first frame or the last frame or jog and shuttle around. But to tell you the truth, there are keyboard commands for all of these time controls, and they're a lot more convenient, I find, than mousing around up here. So I tend to recommend that you close this window down and learn the keyboard shortcuts. If you really want to use this, you're welcome to keep it open, but I'm going to shut it down to make us a little more room here on our small, cramped NTSC window. So now we can move this over a little bit to here. The info window, if we open a piece of footage real quick, the info window in general gives you information, pixel information, of the RGB and alpha information as it passes over a layer. But it also gives you all sorts of context-specific information, like when you're moving a layer around, it tells you where you are in pixels or how far you've moved. and can give you a lot of useful stuff that I'll be pointing out as we go along. But that's a good one to keep open. You don't do a lot of audio editing in After Effects, and to tell you the truth, the audio editing capabilities are not terribly well implemented. So the most useful thing I can recommend that you do with the audio control panel is close it and get it out of the way, because it takes up an awful lot of room. All right, so on the outside chance that you've imported other files or otherwise messed around with our generic project, let's go to the File menu and pick Revert Project to clean things up back to their happy state. Okay, once it's back to its old clean self, we're going to create a new composition by picking New Composition from the Composition window. Or you can hit Control-N on the keyboard. Let's name the comp First Try. Let's change the size to 320 by 240, which for some reason is called large. Square pixels is fine. Keep it at full resolution. We'll set the frame rate to 15 frames a second and the duration to 4 seconds. Hit OK. All right. Now let's look at the composition window. This is the stage where you position your elements and you animate them. You can have as many comps as you want in a project, and each comp can have a unique name, length, size, resolution, frame rate, and pixel aspect ratio. Because comps can be so unique, each comp will have its own associated timeline window. Now, these two are connected together, but sometimes you might accidentally close one by mistake, so the way to get it back is to just click the little square box that you see, and it brings it back. That works both ways. If for some reason you close the stage down, you can click the little square box there, and it brings the comp window back. Now, if you ever decide to change the settings of a composition once you've created it, there are a number of ways you can do it. If you like playing around with a mouse, you can just click on the name of the comp there, and it brings up the composition settings where you can change them. If you like keyboard shortcuts, Control-K does the same thing. And if you can't remember either of those, up under the Composition menu, Composition Settings will bring up the same box. Now, if you just need to change the name of a comp, you just select it in the project window, highlight it, hit the return key, and type in a new name. Now that we have a comp, we need to add some footage to it. So select the cloud pics from the project window, drag them into the comp. Now, cloud pics is the same size as the comp, so it snaps right into place, filling the window. There we go. All right, in our timeline, hit the space bar, or you can push the play button in the VCR controllers if you've left it open, and watch the clouds roll by for a second. Push space bar again to stop it. Hit it again, start it. We can watch the progress of the timeline down here in the timeline window. And now if the movie plays off the end of the timeline, the screen will go gray. Just hit the space bar again, and it'll start the movie again from the beginning. And stop it after a second. Let's add another image. Let's go to the text folder and add Neat Stuff. In fact, let's use Neat Stuff to illustrate a couple of different ways that you can add footage to a comp. For instance, you can drag it straight to the timeline. If the timeline happened to be closer, hit Control-Z, which is the undo shortcut. You can pick Neat Stuff. Let's open the project window a little bit wider, and drag Neat Stuff into the comp in the project window. In both of those cases, it will show up centered in the composition. And we can hit the delete key. It's another way to remove footage you've added accidentally. Or you can select Neat Stuff and hit Control/, and that also adds it into the center of a comp. These last two ways of adding footage are faster, but dragging the element directly into the composition is the only way to position it precisely. So let's drag it on in. Now this element is smaller than the composition, but notice that it still snaps to the center. In fact, it also snaps to the sides of the comp, the top and the bottom, and the corners of the comp. Drag it to the center, let it go. Now if you click and drag it again, you'll see it's not snapping anymore. So now you can really precisely line things up. But if you need to make it snap again, Holding down the Shift and Alt keys as you drag will force it back into snap mode, and will snap things again back to the sides, the corners, etc. Like many other graphic programs, if you hold down the Shift key while you're moving something, it constrains the motion into the vertical or into the horizontal. For the time being, let's drag Neat Stuff up just a tad into the top half of the screen. Now if you look down here at the timeline, you'll see the two elements that we drug in. We brought the clouds in first, so they're at the bottom. Every element that you bring into a comp is a layer, and you can have as many layers as your computer's RAM will accommodate. Every layer has a gray time bar that indicates where in the composition it starts and it stops. The numbers at the top of the timeline indicate where you are time-wise: 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, 4 second. And if you've followed my directions so far, you'll notice that Neat Stuff's layer seems to start a little bit after the cloud movie does. Well, that's because an element's in point in time is set to wherever the blue time marker is when you drag it in. This is one of the most common little mistakes in After Effects, to accidentally drag in an element at the wrong time. But it's a very easy thing to fix. The easiest thing to do is to just grab the gray bar in the middle and slide the element over to the left. If you hold the Shift key down, it snaps to the first frame, and you can let it go. Notice also that this picked file, which is a still, is set with a duration that is equal to the length of the comp. The cloud-picked movie, on the other hand, is 10 seconds long. So in a 4-second comp, the back end of the cloud movie runs off the end of the timeline. Up in the comp window, we consider the layers to be stacked from back to front. In the timeline window, it goes from bottom to top. If you click and drag Neat Stuff's name below the cloud movie, it'll go behind the clouds, and you can't see it in the comp window anymore. Drag it back up to the top, and Neat Stuff comes back to the front. Or drag the cloud movie behind it, and things pop back where they were. Now make sure that you grab the layer's name, not the gray bar. If you try to drag the gray bar, well, you can't reorder layers that way, but you are likely to accidentally move your layer forward and backwards in time and screw up your animation. All right, let's add action to our scene. It's up here in the text. Drag it in and position it so that it just overlaps Neat Stuff. Now, Actions layer shows up at the top of the list, here in the timeline. There are now 3 items there. If you want to select any layer, of course, you can click on its name. But there's a number at the beginning of each of the layers. And if you type those numbers over on the numeric keypad, that will also select the layers, although it only works for the top 9 layers. Click somewhere empty to deselect everything, or you can use the Tab key. And you can also select things by clicking on them directly in the comp window. Again, click somewhere empty, in this case in the pasteboard, to deselect. Holding down the Shift key lets you add things to a selection and then subtract them again. And there's a little quirk about selecting things. If you select something first that covers an entire composition like this, and then try to select something in front of it, After Effects doesn't let you do it. There's a good reason for this. Often you'll get multi-layers that are all the same size, and once you've selected something, you want to be able to manipulate it. So once it's selected, After Effects assumes that you want to drag it around. Well, if you don't, if you just want to deselect it and select something else, again, hold the Shift key down to deselect it, then click again to select. Shift to deselect, Shift to select again. All right, Action should still be positioned slightly over Neat Stuff. Now with Action selected, use the Control key and the up-down arrow keys to move layers backwards and forwards layer-wise in the composition. Watch the layer's name in the timeline and you'll see what I mean. Another shortcut, if you have a whole bunch of layers, is Control B will send something all the way to the back, and Control F will bring it all the way to the front of a comp. All right, make sure Action is back in the front. Okay. Now, click and drag, and then hold the Shift key down to constrain its motion. Drag it down so that's in the center of the bottom half of the comp. Now notice you can tell when a layer is selected by the 8 little squares that appear around it. Plus, there's a little circle with an X in the center. Now the squares are handles that allow you to resize a layer. If you drag the handles on the side, it resizes in only one dimension. And if you drag the handles on the corner, you can resize it in 2 dimensions simultaneously, including turning it inside out. Click and drag and then hold the Shift key down and it'll constrain the aspect ratio to its original proportions. But always remember to click first, then hold the Shift key down, or you deselect it. Double click on the pointer tool will reset a layer to its original size. Now let's repeat what just went on there. If you hold the Shift key down first and then try to grab a corner box to resize something, well, remember we were just talking about the Shift key selecting and deselecting things. If you want to resize something proportionally, click the box in the corner first, then hold down the Shift key. Going to play with resizing things again, only this time we'll hold down the Alt key as we're dragging things. Now, depending on the speed of your machine, with the Alt key held down, you can see things as you're manipulating them. It's not really a real-time preview, but the faster your machine, the faster this preview will be. And even on a slow machine, this can be very, very useful for eyeballing things. Now, this is a general rule with anything that can be adjusted with the mouse in After Effects. A slider, the rotation, the scale, the opacity, all of these things, if you use the Alt key in conjunction with the controls, you'll be able to see a preview of what you're manipulating as quickly as the computer can get it to real time. Double click again to bring it back to 100%. Select the Rotate tool and rotate your object. If you Alt rotate it, once again, you can see it previewing in real time. Now, if you add the Shift key to that, it constrains the rotations to 45-degree angles. And if you double-click on the Rotate tool, it brings things back to their original settings. Now, since most of the manipulation you're going to do to any given layer happens with one of these 2 tools, it's a good thing to know, again, that the keyboard shortcut to toggle between these 2 also happen to be right next to each other on the keyboard. They're the Q key, which gives you the arrow, and the W key gives you the Rotate tool. There are keyboard shortcuts to move, rotate, and scale things, and they come in very handy. The arrow keys nudge things around a screen pixel at a time. Over on the numeric keypad, the plus and minus keys rotate a layer clockwise or counterclockwise a degree at a time. And Alt plus or minus on the numeric keypad scales the layer up or back down a percentage point at a time. Now add the Shift key to any of these things and you multiply them by 10. Shift arrow keys move things 10 screen pixels at a time. Shift plus and minus and you rotate 10 degrees at a time. Shift Alt plus or minus and you scale up and scale down 10% at a time. Now, hardly anyone I know uses these plus and minus keys on the numeric keypad, but they're a good time saver when you're quickly laying things out, and I recommend that you try to use them when you can. Now, you may have noticed by now that things tend to rotate and scale around this little circle with the X thingy here in the middle of the layer. Double-click on our tools to reset our values. That's known as the anchor point. Sometimes you don't want the anchor point to be in the middle of an object. You want it to scale around some other point. That's what this tool is good for. This is the anchor point tool, or the pan behind tool if you're using it in the mask window. But the anchor point tool lets you move the anchor point to a different position in a composition. And once it's there, when you scale, the layer scales around that point now. And when you rotate, the layer rotates around that point. Sometimes you'll need to get a little closer to your work. You have a variety of options for zooming in and out of a comp. First, there's the Zoom tool, right here, which zooms in wherever you click it. Alt-click and you zoom back out again. Now, it's often quicker, instead of using the zoom tool, to use one of many keyboard shortcuts. Now, the same shortcut from Photoshop works here, and that's Control plus and minus up there at the top of the keyboard, not the one over on the numeric keypad. But Control plus and minus can be problematic. Control minus is okay. You shrink the window. But note that the whole window shrinks to snap it down to the size of the layer. And, well, Control plus makes the window grow. And before too long, your window will take over your entire screen, and you won't be able to get into your other windows. So personally, I find a different keyboard shortcut a little handier. And that's the period and the comma keys. Or if you'll look at the little symbols directly above the period and the comma, you've got a little left-hand arrow there and a little right-hand arrow. Well, that zooms in and zooms out of the layer without resizing the window. It's not Control period or Control comma. It's just period or comma. One key. The layer window stays the same size, and things stay manageable. Now, in addition to those choices, you can also select any of a variety of zoom ratios from the pop-up here in the bottom left corner. Once again, this pop-up doesn't resize the window. Before we move on, you can stop the tape if you like and practice adding and moving elements around and setting zoom resolution settings. We'll continue working with this project as it looks now, though, so you may want to save a copy of it before you play with it too much. When you're ready to move on, load up your saved file and start the tape again. If you're ready to continue now, let's move on to the next section. All right, with our generic project loaded up where you left it off, let's take a closer look at the timeline. Now, bear with me, we'll start animating things in just a bit, but you need to know what's going on here. The timeline has to be your best friend if you want to be productive in After Effects. The blue thingy at the top marks the current time. A glance at that can tell you exactly where you are in a composition. You can clearly drag it around. If you Alt drag it, it will attempt to update the window as quickly as it can. And you'll notice as we're dragging things around that the time code over on the left changes to tell you exactly what frame you're on. Now, if you want to jump exactly to a particular time, you can just click there or click near and drag. If you don't feel like dragging a great distance, you can just click, or you can click on the time code to bring up the Go to Time window. Enter in a new time. Periods work just fine. And you jump right to whatever you enter in. There's also a timeline window, or a time code window rather, at the bottom of the comp window. Click on that. Brings up the Go to window, and it works just fine there as well. If you don't want to click in either of those places, but you like the Go to command, you can hit Control G, and it brings it right up. Now, if you want to use keyboard shortcuts to move around in time, the keys directly above the arrows on your keyboard are the ones you want to use. Page up and page down takes you backwards and forwards one frame at a time. The home key takes you to the beginning of a composition. The end key takes you to the end of a composition. Now, Shift, page up and page down, take you back and forth 10 frames at a time. Now, just because I want to be thorough, I also want to point out that the Control left and right arrows duplicate the same commands as the page up, page down. And of course, Shift Control left arrow and Shift Control right arrow do the same thing, only 10 frames. Now, whether you drag or whether you use the arrow keys, if you move one frame off the end of the comp, things go blank, but you can still set keyframes there. Now, this is so you can set up loopable animations. Now, I'll demonstrate that a little bit later in the tape. But the last visible frame of your composition is actually one frame before the last frame you can drag to. Now, let's set up a simple animation. We want to work on just one element at a time, so we'll turn off the visibility of the action layer. That's the little eye under the V switch here. And because we don't want to accidentally click and drag around our cloud movie, we're going to lock it. That's the little lock switch that you see right here. set your timeline to the first frame of the comp by either dragging the timeline or just hitting the home key. There's a little arrow to the left of the Neat Stuff layer. Click it. It twirls down and reveals two labels, Mask and Geometrics. Twirl down the one next to Geometrics, and you reveal 5 geometric properties: anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Now to the right of each property under the time marker is a little I-beam. The I-beam tells you that the value of this property is constant, not animated. To the left of each property is a little stopwatch icon. If you click a stopwatch next to position, a little diamond-shaped icon appears over here. This is a keyframe. Now to make a little more room on my screen here, I'm going to make my comp take up less room by hitting Control- at the top of the keyboard to shrink down the comp window. Now, if you don't need to make room, you don't need to do this. But I'm going to drag the Neat Stuff picked to the upper left-hand corner of the composition, somewhere around here. This is going to be the starting point of our animation. In the timeline, move the timeline marker to 2 seconds and drag the picked file to here. As you drag it, you see this dotted line connecting the starting point with the current position that we're setting. And as soon as we release it, a new keyframe appears in the timeline down here. Now once you've set a layer to animate, just changing a property at a new point on the timeline will set a keyframe. Hit the end key above the arrows. That takes us to the last visible frame of the animation. And now drag the layer here. You'll see the dotted line curve smoothly through the center point, and another keyframe will appear in the timeline. You have just made an animation. Let's preview the results. Now make sure the layer that you want to preview is selected, it should be, and tap the 0 key on the numeric keypad. Just take a second to calculate, and then a little wireframe preview will appear and show you your motion in real time. It'll continue to cycle through the work area until you hit a key again. Cool, huh? Now, as long as the layer is selected, you can see the motion path in the comp window. As long as the preferences are set up to show it, you can change that. The motion path is a true Bezier path, like in Illustrator. You can adjust its shape by moving the little handles that come out of each keyframe. The keyframes are these little X's along the path. You click on one of the X's, and you can see it has these little handles coming out of it. And by adjusting those handles, you can adjust the shape of the path. Adjust the path so that it looks something, that one's a little hard to find, like, oh, let's have some fun. We'll twist it around. Make it look something like this. Okay. Now preview the animation again. Remember, that's the 0 key on the numeric keypad. And you can see that our layer now follows the new path, just as we drew it. Okay, let's animate some other properties. Let's enable animation for scale by clicking on the little stopwatch. Now that sets a keyframe for scale where we left the timeline last, which was at the end of the animation. The value that it set was 100%, because that's the default value, because we haven't changed the scale of the thing yet. So that's fine. Let's move our timeline back to the beginning of the animation and change this value by clicking on it and entering a new value. Let's say 0. Preserve frame aspect ratio is checked, so changing a value in one box affects the other box with the exact same value. We accept that, and now it's at 0% scale at the beginning of the animation. the end of the animation, it's at 100%. So if we preview our animation now, as it follows the path that we drew, it should also scale up from 0 to 100%. And it does. Now, notice that the keyframes for scale and for position are independent of each other. Our position properties has 3 keyframes, whereas our scale property only has 2. All animation channels operate independently of each other in After Effects. We're free to click and drag our scale 100% value to anywhere that we want. It just means it'll get to 100% quicker, but it doesn't in any way change the path. Let's preview that. Now it gets to 100% a little bit quicker before its motion is finished. We can move that back. Okay, now I've resized our window a little bit here so we can see things a little more clearly. Got rid of the info window to give ourselves a little more room so you can see things better. Let's animate another property. Let's animate rotation this time. Now the default value for scale, you'll remember, was 100%. Well, the default value for rotation is 0 degrees because we haven't rotated anything yet. So we're going to set a keyframe and start animating rotation. There's the keyframe. It starts at 0 degrees. If we move to the last frame and click this little box here, we'll add another keyframe without changing the value. This can sometimes be very valuable. Right now we've got 2 keyframes, but there isn't anything happening between the 2. And the reason we set 2 like this is because now we want to move in between the 2 and change the value. That means it'll now start at 0 degrees, animate to whatever we change it to now, and then go back to 0 again. We've saved ourselves a couple of mouse clips by not having to add the 3rd keyframe and change the value back. We click the little underlined value here and we add 1 revolution and say 270 degrees. Okay, note that the keyframe was added exactly where the blue time marker is. Keyframes are always added wherever the time marker is. Let's preview our animation. Okay. We've created a nice little entrance for neat stuff. It would be nice if it sort of held on screen at the end instead of just abruptly ended. So let's add a second to the end of our animation here. You can hit Control-K or click on the first try name here to bring up the composition settings. We'll change our duration to 5 seconds. Hit Return. Now, the timeline window has changed a little bit down here. We're still looking at the same amount of time that we were before, 4 seconds. Because even when you change the time, it keeps things zoomed to the same resolution. But the appearance of that little gray area up there tells us that there's some extra time in our composition. And if you click on the little handle and drag it out, we reveal the extra time. Sure enough, there is another second. Our keyframes have all stayed where we set them in time, but now we have an extra second of space to play with at the end of our animation. If we had wanted to, we could have also zoomed out by hitting the little zoom out key here on the right side of the window. Okay, now let's see what our preview looks like. Look at the distance, it's neat stuff. It flies in, it bounces off the wall, it falls down into place, and it looks much better as it holds for a second there at the end. Now, our animation is still a little bit robotic. It's a little bit abrupt. After Effects gives us a lot of little tools to smooth things out and make things look a lot more natural, for want of a better word. If in the real world neat stuff was flying around, it would look a little different from this. A useful tool in a case like this is the ability to smooth out keyframes. Now, if you notice, the keyframes are all shaped like little diamonds now. Well, this is telling us that these are linear keyframes. The values are changing from one to another in a perfectly straight line. If we select these last 2 keyframes, say, for rotation, and you can do that by marqueing around both of them, under the Layer menu, there's a sub-menu called Keyframe Assistance, and the first one that you come to is Easy Ease. If you pick that, the shape of our keyframes will change from the diamond to a little dumbbell shape. And that's telling us that we now have a Bezier curve in our velocity curve going through these keyframes, and the motion will now be smooth through these two rotation keyframes rather than abruptly changing from value to value. Let's see what that looks like so you'll see what I mean. If we preview the animation again with the 0 key on the keypad, and you'll see the rotation smooths in there and smooths into the last position. Looks a lot more natural. Smoothing keyframes is one of the main tips for making your motion seem more natural in After Effects. Another tip, if you can spare the rendering time and if you like the look of things, is enabling motion blur for an object. Down here in the timeline, there's a bunch of little switches, little icons to the right of the name of your layer. We'll discuss these in detail shortly, but right now, up above them, you'll see a button that says Enable Motion Blur. If you turn that on, which enables motion blur for the entire composition, and then enable motion blur for the layer by clicking the box under the letter M. And if you look at the results up in your timeline now, turning on motion blur generates an actual geometric motion blur for the object as it flies through space. If we move our timeline around, you can see that as our layer spins around and tumbles around and moves, it's actually generating a true motion blur. This can really add a lot of realism to a comm. If you have a fast enough processor, we're running on 132 megahertz 9500 right now, so this isn't all that speedy, but if you hit the space bar, After Effects still does a pretty good job of generating this motion blur quickly. Very cool. You notice as it comes to a rest at the end, it's not moving anymore, so the blur goes away. Now would be a great time to actually output a movie so you can preview what this all looks like at full speed. Go up to the Composition menu and select Make Movie, or the keyboard shortcut for that is Control-M. Let's save it to our desktop so we can find it quickly. And accept the name that it gives you, First Try Movie. This brings up the Render Queue window. Now, the Render Queue is a really terrific thing. There's nothing as well implemented as this in any other program I've found. I love this window. Right now, though, all we're going to pay attention to is these little pop-ups down here. Our render settings, we'll switch to Best, because we want all of our wonderful things like motion blur to render out at best quality. We'll keep the output module at lossless, and we'll click Render. A little progress bar starts moving across the render queue. It tells us how much time has elapsed. Tells you exactly where you are in the animation. And gives you an estimated remaining time for when the movie is going to be done. When After Effects finishes, it rewards you with a little magic bell sound. And let's play it and see what it looks like. Very cool, huh? Great clouds, courtesy of Colorado altitudes. All right, so that wasn't exactly a Spielberg film, but you're learning. This would actually be a great time to practice some of the things that we've covered. So go down to the timeline window, turn on the visibility of the action layer, and let's animate it doing the same move that the Neat Stuff layer did, except that the action movie will fly in from the bottom right, spin around on the left, and end up at the top, as if they were sort of dancing around each other. The final results should look something like this. Okay? Consider this your storyboard. There are a few things to avoid when working with keyframes, and if I point them out to you now, maybe it'll save you a few pitfalls along the way. If your animation, once you start putting this project together, just isn't working out the way you expected it, then look at your keyframes. The first thing you need to know is that if you don't have two keyframes, you don't have any animation. You have to have 2 keyframes at least, and the values in the keyframes have to be different, or you won't have any animation. Animation is a change between values. So if a property isn't animating, the first thing to check is to make sure that you have 2 keyframes. If you do have 2 keyframes and nothing's happening, then what's probably happening is that both keyframes are set to the same value. So check each keyframe and make sure that the values are what you expect. Now, the timeline, as you move it around, will give you feedback in the boxes over here as to what's going on between the keyframes. It tells you exactly what the value is wherever the time marker is in the timeline. The boxes don't tell you what the value is in a highlighted keyframe unless the keyframe is underneath the time marker. It's a common mistake for people to select a keyframe, change a value in the box without moving the blue timelight marker over. But what that does instead, say we change it to 50, is it adds a new keyframe where you are. It doesn't change the value of the keyframe that you had highlighted. Now, we haven't talked much about these boxes right here. They're all empty right now, and what that's telling us is that there's no keyframe where we are right now. This is true. If we move to the middle, you'll see that there's a keyframe here for position, which there is. There's a keyframe here for rotation, which there is. And there's no keyframe at scale, so the box is empty. The arrows to the right and the left of the box give us a quick way to navigate from keyframe to keyframe. Clicking the right arrow will take us to the first keyframe to the right of wherever we are. It's the last keyframe, so there isn't a right arrow there anymore. We click the left arrows, it takes us to the previous keyframe. And just play with these switches and make sure that you understand how to navigate around with them. Now, if you want to add a keyframe somewhere, you can do it just by clicking in the box here. But if you're planning on adding a keyframe and changing the values, you might as well just modify the values. The keyframe will add itself. You can force a keyframe with this box, and sometimes you want to do that. For instance, the way we did it early, where we wanted to set 2 keyframes with the same value, that's a quick way to do it. But generally speaking, you want to set keyframes by changing values, not by clicking in this box here. Now, one reason for that is if you get in the habit of adding keyframes by clicking in the box here, it's easy, particularly when you're starting out, to forget and accidentally click on the watch over here instead of clicking on the box. And if you click on the watch to add a keyframe, you're turning off the animation for that property and all of your keyframes go away. Fortunately, if you hit Control-Z or if you pick Undo from the Edit menu, you can bring those keyframes back. Now, there's a couple of different ways to delete a keyframe. You can move the little box on top of a keyframe and click the X, and then that keyframe will go away. We'll undo that, but it's much easier to just click on the keyframe itself to highlight it and hit the Delete key. Has the same effect. We'll undo that again. What makes that better is if you get used to it, you can select more than one keyframe at a time. If you shift-click on keyframes, you can select as many as you would like in any order that you would like and delete them. We'll undo that again. Or if you like, once they're selected, you can click and drag and move them around in the timeline as a connected bunch of keyframes. This is a great way to adjust where groups of keyframes need to occur in an animation. You can also, once you've selected keyframes, which you can again do by just clicking on them, by shift-clicking to add, or by drawing this little marquee box by clicking and dragging around the keyframes that you want to grab. Or if you want to select all of the keyframes in a property, click on the name of that property, and boom, it'll select all of the keyframes for that property. This is very useful, particularly when you get into something like motion math, which generates a bazillion keyframes, or when you're working on a really long project and you have a wide window and a lot of keyframes to select. Just clicking on the name selects all the keyframes for that property. Now, once they're selected, you can copy and paste keyframes just as if you were in a word processor. If you select all of the keyframes for position and copy with Control-C, select the action layer, and hit Control-V to paste them, well, it pastes the keyframes back in. But notice that it pastes them starting wherever you are in the timeline. We selected keyframes that began at time 0. There was another one at 2 and another one at 4, but because our timeline marker was at 2, when we pasted them back in, the first keyframe came in at 2. The keyframe that was in 2 was now at 4, and the one that was in 4 is now off of the timeline over at 6. We don't want to do that, so we want to move back to 0 and paste. And our action clip will now be animated with the same position values as the neat stuff picked was. So that's a little hint for how you might get some values for this next project. And one more thing that I want to point out to you before we let you try your exercise, I want to talk about how they behave when you delete a bunch of them. Let's select all of the keyframes for position. Notice our time marker is set at 2 seconds. Now remember, our first keyframe for position started up in the upper left, our second keyframe moved off to the right, and our last keyframe centered itself at the bottom of the comp. Now if we just hit delete, hit the delete key, notice that neat stuff popped up to its initial position. So when you delete a bunch of keyframes with the delete key, the default position becomes whatever the first keyframe was. Just so you know. However, we'll undo that if we're in the same setup that we had before, 3 keyframes, and our timeline is still at 2 seconds. And instead of deleting the keys with the delete key, we simply turn off the animatability of the layer by clicking on the stopwatch. Well, all of the keyframes go away, and the default value for the layer has set itself to the value that was underneath the current point in the timeline. So now we basically left our position value over here on the right, which was where it was when we turned off the animation. It's a subtle difference, these two ways of deleting keyframes, but this can actually be a helpful animation tool once you're used to the two ways things work. Let's undo a few times to get things back to where they were before. And there we go. Okay, now before you begin animating action, highlight it. We'll bring back our toolbox that we brought out of the way. Okay. And using the anchor point tool, bring the anchor point back into the center of the layer. All right, we've reset action now so that we can begin working with it. Now, try your first exercise. Turn off the tape now and give it a try. If you get stuck, rewind the tape a little bit and go through it again. You'll get it. When you've rendered your masterpiece and you're ready to move forward, come back to this point in the tape and let's move on. Now, just in case you're interested, I'm going to run through how I would have solved this animation problem. To tell you the truth, the first thing I would have done is copied and pasted every one of these keyframes and just adjusted the motion paths. I select all the keyframes, I copy, I select action, I make sure I move back to 1 second, twirl this down to see what we're doing, and I select paste. I now have 2 layers that if we move around through time and look at it, we'll see they're both smacked right on top of each other and they're doing exactly the same thing. Action doesn't have its blur turned on, so we'll turn the blur on for action. Okay, now they're both behaving the same. All we need to do now is adjust the motion path of action so that it's actually coming from and going to where we want it to. So let's, when all of those keyframes are selected, you get that movement thing. So let's deselect everything. We'll select action and grab the first keyframe. We'll move it down here to the lower right. Adjust its little Bezier handle. Drag the middle keyframe over here to the left and twirl it around like this. Drag this keyframe up to the top and pull this around there. There we go. We'll adjust that middle loop a little bit. And the scaling and the rotation stuff should have been just fine the way they were, and although I didn't do it in the demo thing, I'm going to reverse the value of the rotation keyframe to -1 resolutions, -270 degrees. And so now it'll rotate in the opposite direction from neat stuff. And that's all it takes. They'll both have the same easing properties because we started with identical keyframes. One will end up at the bottom, though, and one will end up at the top. Now, you probably noticed during the course of the last exercise that this timeline, I'm going to make it fill the whole window here because we're going to talk about it for just a little bit, has a lot of potential for getting out of control. We've got 3 fairly simple layers here with just a handful of properties animated in each of those layers. And already we've got something that even on this, it is a small monitor, but it's taking up most of the screen and it's looking awfully complicated. So the first recommendation I can give you is to get a second monitor, get a second video card, get a second monitor and use the second monitor primarily to hold the timeline and the occasional small palette that you need to pull off out of the way. This can be a big help in keeping things organized. But it's not an option for everybody, and even in those cases, it's not going to do you that much good when you get a very complicated project with 40 or 50 or 100 or 200 layers in the composition, which is not unheard of when you're animating things like text and so on. So After Effects gives you a lot of ways to customize the timeline view to make things a little easier to manage. I'm going to apply an effect to action here. We're not going to talk about effects right now, but I'm going to pick an admittedly big effect, the cyclonist effect from DigiEffects, terrific effect. But if we twirl down cyclonist and twirl down the mask, look at all of the potential animatable properties that we suddenly have to animate on this one layer. By the time you add effects and so on to several different layers, you're talking about something that gets massively unmanageable. So if you look at the properties, the main properties that you're going to be animating here are the 7 that come up by default when you first twirl down the arrow. Mask shape, mask feather, anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. These all have a little keyboard shortcut, and you don't need a control key or an alt key. You just need to remember the name of the property to do what's called solo that property in the timeline. For example, if we knew we only wanted to animate position, you just type the letter P for position. Now, position is the only property that's visible underneath action. You've got access to all of its keyframes and its switches and its values, but you've saved yourself an enormous amount of room in the timeline by just typing the letter P. Now, in the case of action and neat stuff, and you can do this to more than one layer at a time, we're not only animating position, but we're animating scale and we're animating rotation as well. So if you hold the Shift key down, you can add properties to a selection like this. S will add scale, and R will add rotation. Pretty cool, huh? As for the other ones, A is for anchor point. Opacity is the letter T. Now, it doesn't make sense until you think in terms of transparency rather than opacity. It's easier to remember. So opacity is T. The mask tools are M for mask shape and F as in Frank for mask feather. So again, let's bring up our scale, Shift P for position, and Shift R for rotation. So in addition, if either of these layers had an audio track, or if any of these layers had an effect applied to it, typing E would bring up the effect by itself, and typing L for audio levels would bring up the audio track. Now, sometimes you get things set up just the way that you like it, but you find that you need to temporarily collapse a layer. Unfortunately, when you uncollapse a layer, just by clicking on it, all the settings that you carefully set were forgotten. So let's solo these properties again. Scale, Shift P, Shift R. Now we have all 3. If you collapse the layers and hold down the Shift key when you open them back up again, it will remember the solo settings that you've set. Okay, we'll open everything wide again. Now, sometimes in any given layer, you may be animating a whole bunch of different properties, and there's only 1 or 2 things that you don't want in there. And sometimes it's more efficient to subtract these elements from your selection rather than closing the thing down and adding 5 properties by hitting the letter keys. To subtract something, you hold down the Alt key and you click on the name of it, and it goes away. If you click on the name of a group, the whole group goes away. All right, now I've rearranged things a little bit so that we can see the comp a little bit better and see the items in the timeline at the same time. Rather than talk about the properties for a second, I want to talk about the switches over here and how they can help you organize things a little bit better. We talked about soloing properties and keeping things neater, but the first of these switches also helps in that respect. These are the shy switches. If you look closely at the little icon, it's sort of a Kilroy was here icon of a little face and a nose peering over a wall. If you click on it, the little face disappears behind the wall, and that means that you've made the layer shy. If we tell Action and Clouds to be shy, and then click Hide Shy Layers, well, those two layers will disappear from the timeline view. They're still up here in the comp. We're not making them invisible. If we wanted to make them invisible, we would have clicked on their little visibility switch. We just don't want to see them in the timeline for now because we want to free up a little bit more room to work on some of the other layers. So by making certain layers shy, you can selectively hide and turn back on layers in the timeline to optimize your workspace. We've already used the switch to the right of that. By clicking on the little lock, you can lock a layer, and once you've locked a layer, you're not able to select it anymore or do anything to it. If you try to select it down here, it gives you a little blink to let you know that it's locked. If our clip had audio in it, let's bring in our the A button will let you turn the audio off. This can sometimes be important because a lot of times when you're working with compositions inside of other compositions, or if you duplicate a layer to do something with a mask perhaps, After Effects will add those two audio waveforms together in such a way that your audio will clip and sound terrible. So if you duplicate a layer that has audio in it, make sure that you turn the audio off on all of the copies that you make of that layer except for one, or you're going to get bad audio. We'll delete that out of there. The little eyeball, as we talked about, is for visibility. If we bring the animation back in where we can see everything, by turning the visibility off, the little eyeball closes and the elements disappear. Now, if you've noticed, the action layer up here has a slightly jaggier edge on it than does the Neat Stuff layer down here. Now, the Neat Stuff layer is a picked file, but the action layer is an Illustrator file. And when Illustrator files are brought into After Effects for the first time, After Effects rips it in at a high quality version and as a draft quality version that doesn't have any anti-aliasing in it, and so you can manipulate it a lot quicker. We'll come back to the little C button here, but the quality switch basically toggles between those settings. When you set it to the bold line, it becomes high quality, and you can see that the edges get much smoother. We won't really notice that in a QuickTime Movie or a picked file because they both at 100%, and they both are pretty close to best quality even when they're in draft. But you certainly notice it on an Illustrator file. The third quality setting is a wireframe setting. If you click it so it's an X, you can still see the sort of box that tells you where your elements are, and they'll move around very quickly without having to actually generate any pixels. But for the most part, you'll want to work in draft quality. And that brings us back to the little C button here. This little icon underneath it enables a switch that when it's on an Illustrator file will allow you to continuously rasterize that Illustrator file. If it's next to a layer, it will allow you to collapse that layer. Now, we'll discuss what collapsing layers mean later on in the series when we get into nesting compositions. But with an Illustrator file, you'll notice, let's bring in another copy of Action just to illustrate this. Okay, even if we set this switch to best quality, if we scale the Illustrator file way up, you'll notice that the edges, even at best quality, are starting to get very blurry. Well, that's because After Effects ripped in the Illustrator file at the resolution that it was originally created back in Illustrator, which was, at about 50-point text at 72 dots per inch. When you scale that up, even at best quality, it gets very soft edges because that's the anti-aliasing that makes the text look smoother when it's at a smaller resolution. By clicking the little C button to continuously rasterize the file, After Effects, rather than ripping the file once when you first bring it in, will rip the file every single frame that something geometric is changing. If we click the button now, you see what I mean. The action layer gets razor sharp, much cleaner, because After Effects is referring back to the original Illustrator geometry to rip this screen. This is a much slower way to work, but it allows you to use an Illustrator file to do incredibly clean zooms in on a client's logo or whatever without actually having to create an ultra high resolution pict file that may take up more memory. The only downside to using a collapsed layer or a continuously rasterized Illustrator file is that once you've done this, you're not allowed to apply an effect to this layer. You'd have to put this layer in its own composition after you've continuously rasterized it, and then apply the effect to that composition. And I'll demonstrate that when we get further down the road. Now, speaking of effects, let's delete the copy of the action. If we apply an effect, such as a quick Gaussian blur or a fast blur to neat stuff, there may be times where we get our effect looking just the way we want it, but then we don't want to wait around while we're working for After Effects to render it. So you can temporarily disable an effect by turning its switch off here. This setting, by the way, can be overridden when it's time to actually render the movie, so don't worry if you've forgotten to turn it back on here. You can force the render queue to turn all the effects that you've applied back on again and override this button. The letter F switch will only be applied to movies, something that has a frame rate. This Cloud Pict, for example, is a movie and has a frame rate. What F means is frame blend. Now, it's nothing that we're really going to see a good example of here in a cloud movie here. I'll put together a good example of this in an animation. But if we were to time stretch this Cloud Pict out to something enormous so that it was running really, really, really slow, by enabling frame blending, After Effects would generate intermediate frames for you. It's not a morphing effect, it's a crossfading effect. So if you had this time stretched to 400% so that there was only one frame for real for every 4 frames of animation, it would actually generate 3 intermediate frames that were crossfades between the real frames. This can go a long way to really smoothing out your motion. The last switch we've already talked about. It's a motion blur, a geometric motion blur. The only thing I want to point out about this that's a possible catch is that there's also an effect in the blur menu called motion blur. So when someone asks you to put a motion blur on something, in all likelihood, they're wanting you to enable the geometric motion blur down here and not simply add the motion blur effect, which works just like the Photoshop motion blur and allows you to blur pixels in one dimension. And that's a tour of the switches. All right, now let's just talk about resolution for a second. We just talked about the quality switch, which lets you toggle between best quality and draft quality and a wireframe quality view. Wireframe is seldom useful, really, for checking out how things really look on the screen, but draft quality even is sometimes a little too high quality to work with quickly. Sometimes, well, just look at this. I mean, this isn't really playing very fast on our machine here. Part of the reason is that it's not a terribly fast machine that we're mastering this on, but part of it is that it's calculating a motion blur. It's pulling numbered pict files and turning them into a movie off of a hard drive, and it's basically calculating a whole bunch of stuff to screen. Well, sometimes we want things to go a little bit faster. We can always toggle to best quality to see how things look, but sometimes, particularly in the case of particles and other harder to calculate effects, we need to bump things down even further to be able to work with them quickly. To do that, you change the resolution of a composition that you're working in. There is a resolution setting in the menu, in the composition menu here, where you can select full, half, third, quarter, or custom. But for most people, it's much quicker to just click on the little gray button that almost doesn't even look like a button here. It just looks like a blank place in the window. So a lot of people don't even know it's there. But if you click on this gray switch, it is a button, and when you click on it, it pops up a little resolution thing. This sets the resolution for the entire comp. It's not a layer by layer thing. It sets the whole composition, and when you set it, for example, to half resolution, What the composition is now doing is rendering only 1 pixel for every 2 horizontal and 2 vertical pixels. So it's really only rendering 1 pixel for every square of 4 pixels, and that speeds things up. Now, if I just hit the space bar now, we won't see that big a speed up because resolution doesn't really speed things up like spooling things off a disk. So before I preview this, let's turn off the cloud pick. Now, with the resolution set a little bit lower, these guys will start spinning around a little bit quicker. And if we bump the resolution down to 1/3, they'll get a little blockier. And move a little quicker. And you can keep adjusting the resolution down until things are almost impossible to see. You can even set your own custom values to something really extreme if you really want to. To create rough draft versions of your renderings. Now, all of these settings that you make in the composition can be overridden when it comes time to go out and actually render your movies. So don't worry too much about keeping different comps at different resolutions. You can always set them back to best resolution when it's time to output the movie. Well, in this first tape, we've taken our first close look at parts of the After Effects interface and created a simple animation. You've learned that you can't have enough screen real estate, just as you'll discover that you can never have enough RAM. In tape 2, we'll pick up right where we left off. We'll even be working with our modified generic project after a short detour, so save things where you have them now. Play around with the concepts you've seen so far. Poke around with the buttons we've talked about until you think you know what they do. And above all, have fun. For Total AE, I'm Brian Maffett, and I'll see you in the next tape. There are several companies who make excellent products that either directly enhance AE's capabilities via plugins or that provide specialty footage that's ready to work right within After Effects. Many of these companies have offered their support of this training series and have provided working demo versions or samples of their products on our CD. In fact, much of the project footage you'll be working with in these tapes was generously provided by these companies.